Anton, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. Well, how about you?
Doing good, doing good. So, Anton, could you go ahead and give us a short bio and just tell us, some things you're interested in?
Yeah, I mean, right now I work mainly in 3D computer vision, state estimation, things like that for robotics. But those are my professional and scientific interests. Beyond that, of course, history of science, culture around technology, all of these things that I think are sort of interesting and important to think about are things that I tend to spend a lot of time on.
I love that. So, Anton, I first found your work. I found this essay called "The Stakes,"
Mhm.
um, and I really feel that sometimes we put too much emphasis on like think about AI risk and not about the risk of AI not happening. So, not enough focus on like on the tech stagnation problem. And it seems like the alternative for a world with the growth, like good growth, is just mouthless, right? And we're all fighting over something. You've got to use, you got to go out and you got to capture someone else's stuff instead of just being able to create it yourself. Can you talk about that a little bit? I think it's a really important concept that is really not discussed enough.
Yeah. So with that essay, I wanted to point out that there's this Malthusian concept of a world that's too crowded and nobody really has enough because any sort of economic surplus quickly gets competed away, and everybody ends up just living this miserable hot box for the rest of essentially for the rest of civilization. That's kind of a short and not entirely accurate version of Malthus' thesis. And if Tyler Cowen hears this, he's going to yell at me, but we'll get to
Right.
that. Um, but what I wanted to talk about is actually the downstream consequences of having the belief that you have this finite world which needs to be divided up. And we have historical examples of those sorts of beliefs and ideologies where the question is who gets what, who should rule, are end up being the most important ones. And so it's important not just from the material consequences, but from the ideologies and beliefs that spring out of a system like that, a closed world. And yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to examine. It's in that essay, but also I think to your point about worrying about the consequences of AI or other kinds of disasters. I think honestly, a lot of, and I think I wrote in that essay that a lot of them are relatively far fetched. There are other problems that we don't really have a great way of facing right now. I mean, the pandemic is a great example of that. We were institutionally incapable, especially throughout the West, of dealing with this. And this was a relatively mild form, and hopefully we learned something from this. If it had been more deadly, we'd be in very, very serious trouble. Not that we're not now. So there are kind of these benign things, and the point that I wanted to make in that essay is we're at a point in history that's unprecedented in the sense that we have this enormous economic surplus, which if we're smart, we can deploy to prevent us getting back into this airtight box again. If
Right.
we deploy it right, and if we actually think about this and actually consider our unique place in history. No other human civilization, not even like the heights of ancient Rome, which relied primarily on a slave and sort of kleptocracy, a theft economy from other people, other places, ever created the sort of economic surplus that we have now. And that's like those 3 points are kind of the things I wanted to raise in that essay.
I really like that. And it feels like as the political battles they feel more, what's the word? Like I was talking to my grandmother, she's much older, and she's like, yeah, it's never felt this vivid before. And like, it feels almost more, what's the word? Desperate, I guess. And I wonder if it's more like we're focusing more on dividing up what we have and less of like how do we create new stuff. And that seems like a real problem. Like you said, we've created the surplus, and this is like the industrial revolution is this tiny blip on like economic growth over human history, and we
Mhm.
want that to continue because all these great things can happen, and we pull people out of poverty. But it seems like we're at kind of this juncture, this kind of, and create this big morass where we need to get out of it.
Yeah, I think a big part of what's causing that and why, I mean, honestly, a big part of it is people are bored and alienated, and
Right.
jumping into this theater of politics and being very performative about what you really believe, is a part of that. People seek meaning and
Right.
wanting to be on this big political stage is a way to fulfill that need. And I think a lot of it is coming from there. And the reason I say that, and the reason that I call it performative, is because sometimes you hear about these people who, describe their beliefs in very hyperbolic ways, in all corners of politics, frankly. But then you ask yourself, well, if you really did believe that, how would you be acting? Right. So if you truly believe, for example, that the government that you live under was an occupying force, for example, how would you act? We can look into history, how people have acted in those situations.
Right.
And so we can, you can sort of test people's beliefs in that. I think there's a subtler point here, though, which is people have lost confidence in our ability to really improve things. I think that at best, people believe that improvement will come from organizing things differently as opposed to actual material progress. And what I mean by that is what I mean by material progress is, things like a nuclear reactor, which is a fundamentally new invention, has in principle enormous impact on society. The internal combustion engine, lead acid batteries, all these things, right? That's a material. That's a piece of material progress that has enormous social impact. But I think people now are more of the opinion that in order for things to improve or at least change, that has to be done at some sort of social organizational level rather than at this material level. Which I think is where a lot of that might be coming from.
Do you think they just conceptualize it as being too hard to make like hard technical progress, or why is it that focus on organization again, or is it just we've gotten really bad at the organization side? You look at the pandemic, just like inability to organize anything, so that kind of it comes to front of mind.
But you sort of have to ask yourself why. And the reason that, for example, politics is the way that it is, and we always seem to be in constant gridlock and never seem to be able to get anything actually done, whether it's improvement or disastrous, is because this is an intentional thing where many more people have a say in how things are done than they did before. And the more people who have a say, the more interests are represented. And the way in which those interests are represented can, of course, conflict with the way other people's interests are represented. And so we end up not being like it's both a good and a bad thing, because it means you can't like bulldoze and evict entire city blocks of people to build your highway anymore. That's probably a good thing. But the consequence of that, the flip side, is we've created this new problem where coordination issues become harder. And we don't yet know how to solve those. And I think like primarily, I think that's honestly a primary cause. And then as people see that we can't solve the sort of material things that require the solution to those coordination problems, they give up on the idea of ever solving the problems at all. Or they fail to see that it's possible to do so.
Gotcha. In 35 episodes or so, we've had a lot of people that come on and we talk about this problem of why are we so much worse at coordination and collective action problems. And a lot of people have said it's something like we used to have these existential threats we were thinking about that would force people to like, maybe overcome this like selfish desire. So maybe it's, the Nazis or the Soviet Union, or there's some big thing like this top of mind. People are going to work 80 hours a week so their kids don't get blown up in this, nuclear catastrophe. Do you buy that at all? I mean, this is a very common thing. We've probably heard this from probably 8 people.
I think for some sector of society, it's probably very true.
Gotcha.
In that it's definitely easier to coordinate a lot of things against a very specific identifiable threat.
Gotcha.
And then and for some sector of society that really helps, and you can hang all kinds of progress and work and frame it in terms of being, we're up against this threat and you doing this work will help us in that direction. And certainly that influences a great deal of people, but it's if we're looking at the Cold War as the most recent one, it's not like society in the West was totally mobilized against this threat. And this comes back again to what I was saying. If you really believed that this was the existential threat, how would you organize your society? So it works for some sector, but I don't believe that that's true in general. I think that there are many other motivations that allow that create amazing, like drive people to do amazing things, and we've preserved those motivations in many parts of society. That's another interesting fact here. I mean, if you consider athletics, if you consider the arts, music, whatever, those are often driven by cultural things that we've managed to preserve for whatever reason, which require less institutional coordination for people to be successful, right? Like if you're going to be an NFL running back, there's a clear path to that with, and very few people there's very few stakeholders on if you become an NFL running back, right, for example, right? So I think it's true to some extent, which I know sounds like equivocation on my part, but having read, having sort of quite deeply gone into both sides of the Cold War and how those two places regarded each other, I don't think that that's a total explanation. I don't even think it's probably the majority of the explanation. I think that it's honestly, a large part of it is probably explicable by the decay of our ability to solve coordination problems, because and which we also did intentionally, because the way we tip the balance is to give many more people equity and
Gotcha.
then to have a say.
Gotcha. So it's like under the slide to like oligarchy or something like that, where you've got more parties you've got to keep happy at the same time, instead of just like this one person coordinating, like General Groves, the Manhattan Project, all these scientists. You could never get these scientists to go to East Tennessee anymore. Like, this is not going to happen, right? Like,
I think scientists are an interesting example. We'll probably get to that later in the show, but it's certainly at almost all levels become more difficult because we've transitioned into this more equitable ratio. And
Gotcha.
I don't, one thing that I don't like when people seek to explain why we can't seem to get things done is they never, they give these exogenous factors as if our inability or our institutional decay is something resembling an oil shock, where there's been some natural disaster and all of a sudden the oil supply is cut off. And it's like, no, we chose this. There's reasons, good reasons, that people decided we ought to do things this way. And we need to look at those reasons too. It's not, anyway, so I do a lot of applied mathematics. It's a large part of my job. And the thing about mathematics is, if you are too easily adopting certain assumptions that seem obviously or trivially true, you will get punched in the face. You will run yourself into a corner of your problem space where it's like, the entire problem was you were running with this assumption that you thought was true, and it just turns out that for this case that's actually very important, it's absolutely not. And so I think of that as sort of like an epistemic paranoia. And I tend to apply it especially in matters of sort of history and things like this in a similar way.
Interesting.
Anton, that's a really elegant and, to me, original idea about why we might have political paralysis, because there's so many perspectives being voiced at the same time. But do you see some kind of possible resolution for this logjam that we've reached?
I have some ideas regarding especially the areas that interest me, and a few of my friends have also been thinking about this problem, and people much more deeply involved in these problems have been thinking about them for quite a while. I think the first step is to recognize that we have this problem, and that we have this problem because there's a trade-off that we made, and it was a trade-off that at the time we made for good reasons.
Right.
But after that, I think we have a few possible approaches. We have something like an increased, basically giving an increased amount of power to more local entities rather than having to decide everything for everyone at the top. We create better frameworks for smaller groups of people to being able to make decisions locally. And in the past, people have talked about, well, there's a natural limit on how groups can make decisions. It's governed by Dunbar's number. It kind of excludes the fact that we've made very large decisions for many more people than Dunbar's number in the past. But you might be able to solve some of these coordination problems by devolving more decision-making capability, real material decision-making capability, not bike shed stuff, but like, how do we want to run our community? How do we want to run our society more locally? That does though present now a different trade-off, which is if you devolve decision-making more locally, each locality only has the resources to do certain types of things. Like, you can't build a Manhattan project out of municipalities in the United States deciding that they want the atomic bomb.
Right.
You can't do that. So that's kind of the trade-off in devolving things locally. Another way to do it is to, and honestly, so I wasn't born in the United States, but I admire the American people. And one of the things that I admire the most about the American people is, especially historically, is the willingness as a country and as a culture to just blindly run enormous experiments and be okay and prepared with the idea that you might fail. And it's a strength and a weakness in the culture, but it's mostly a strength. And I think bringing back the idea of experimentation at different institutional levels and saying, okay, we differ on these policies, but what we're going to do is we're going to figure out a version of this where we can run the experiment, where it's sort of sufficiently firewalled, like, for example, right, let's say for whatever reason you want to remove fluoride from the drinking supply. Right. This might, you probably couldn't do it nationally right away if you wanted to. I don't know why you would, but if you wanted to, but some locality might decide, yeah, we as a locality are okay with removing fluoride from our water supply and seeing what happens. We're signed up for the adventure. And then we can, watch and observe and see what happens and be like, well, that was clearly a terrible decision. Let's not do that. Or actually, we found out, these other effects. We should learn from that, and we might institute those policies at a higher level. So those are the two planks that I kind of foresee. More experiments, being more okay with policy failures and creating a system that's robust to policy failures and saying, well, that kind of sucked, but we're going to make, whoever was affected whole to the best way we can. And we're going to move on, and we're going to make sure that we don't forget the lessons that we learned. Or if it turns out one of our experiments goes really, really well, we ought to have mechanisms that allow us to introduce that in other places, and for other people to have those results communicated to them and see, well, actually, this went really well, and here's the reasons why, and we think it'll work for you too. And those are like things that I think can break this. Right now, we have this static mentality, and kind of, Will, you were alluding to this earlier, where it kind of seems like everybody's fighting over this same territory as if only one group of people could control the whole thing, right? And if we eliminate a little bit of that idea and we kind of reintroduce this idea of, actually, let's just do things differently here and try it there and such and such. And of course, with like buy-in from the people who it's going to affect. But that, of course, that's actually a really nice bounding on how badly you can mess up at the same time in the early experiments too. I think those are way forward. They're difficult problems, don't get me wrong. And again, political science and social theorists who've been thinking about this for years and years could probably give you much more color on that.
Got it. Anton, I wanted to ask you, I kind of read a lot of your work as kind of like a call for responsibility among like elites in the West. And maybe that's not fair. I'd love to get your feedback on that. But it does seem to be something real that has been lost. I mean, just recently, last night, I was thinking about, like all these McKinsey executives that were helping Purdue Pharma, design these comp strategies for this, sales. And so we can get, the opioids out to the masses here. And I was just thinking, I wrote a piece in undergrad, that was like, our elites, like our smartest students at university should not be going to McKinsey or Bain or wherever. They should be going to try and build things. And the school actually censored out McKinsey and all this stuff because they were afraid that the recruiters would see that and wouldn't want to hire. I mean, it was amazing. But do you think that's a real world phenomenon?
So I think that's interesting. And again, one has to ask the question of why. So let's suppose that such a thing as the elite exists, and let's suppose that the elite is actually represented by, smart kids going off to do management consulting at places like McKinsey.
Right.
So we need to ask ourselves, why does a student who came into undergrad probably with some beliefs in their mind that they would become a scientist or a physicist, right, or an economist or anything like that. Like you remember your time in high school. You didn't. I believe very few people as children want to become McKinsey consultants. I'm sure
one
some
wants to be a management. Yeah, very rare.
But I think it's rare. And I bet some of those people are just the children of McKinsey consultants. But we have to ask ourselves, what causes that change? Why is it that children or young adults are dissuaded from pursuing these things, which I guess when you say elite responsibility, you're talking about working in those fields that will provide material progress for society as a whole, right? Let's say that's the responsibility you're talking about. well. So the question is, why are people being diverted from that? Well, I think there's a few reasons, and I think the primary reason, and I know that you had a podcast about this, so I'm going to be heretical here, but I actually think we don't have elite overproduction. I think we have elite underproduction. I think we're utilizing these smart people in very poor ways. I think that the issue is not that, these people who go off to be management consultants, they really should become scientists and invent the next cancer drug. Well, why aren't they doing that? Because we're not able to utilize them well for that purpose. This is you might say that it's a market failure if you're an economist. If the thing that we desire is not what we're allocating resources toward, in this case, people or people's minds, then there's a reason we're failing to allocate that. And you can't say that it's responsibility, because without examining the reasons why people choose to do management consulting over becoming, say, research scientists or astronauts or test pilots or whatever it is, it's like, well, how are those people being utilized? What do those tracks look like? Why would people select against them? You have to. I think this is another problem in the discourse, that we have collectively decided that people's attributes are immediate, like the surface attributes and the actions that they take reflect completely on who they are as a person without ever examining how they got there. And,
right.
And we need more. We need just to think about this more as a process. And so, on that topic of elite responsibility, I think that, well, this comes back to what I was saying earlier. We should be doing way more experiments. We should be figuring out why the kid who wanted to be a physicist goes off and works as a quant at a hedge fund, right? I mean, I know the answer to that, and maybe we'll get into it, but we should be like, okay, we don't want that. We're going to try this other thing. We should try the experiment.
Yes, I want to hear, why you think that kid goes and works as quant. I think if I had to guess, and tell me if I'm wrong again, it's something about what Don actually talks about, where it used to be you could go and you can get a little bit of money and you could work on that, wacky idea you've had and make that happen over 20 years. But now you've got to go and you got to sell to the grant making agencies. You've got to fight with other faculty, and that really sucks. I don't know.
Yep. And I would completely agree with that. And, when faced with grinding it out in academia or grinding it out in finance, well, at least you get paid in finance.
Exactly.
So, if that's the choice that you as a smart kid who wants to do physics is faced with, that makes sense. And the other part of that to examine is there's a feedback effect. If you're an undergrad in physics and you go and learn that your upper classmates and even PhDs, where do they end up? They don't end up doing physics most of the time. They go to Boston Consulting Group, or they go to, Rentec or wherever, right? Or they go found startups doing software stuff in Silicon Valley. You are not motivated to continue along the path of becoming a physicist because you don't see anybody who actually went and did that. It's very rare.
Right.
And that, again, that speaks to our inability to actually utilize people who want to do physics. So, and that ties nicely. So, as you know, earlier this week, I spoke to Don as well. We read through his book as part of an Inter-Intellect book club I was recently running. And Don and I, agree on some things, disagree on a few others. But jointly, I think we both agree that the academy, which is in principle the producer of these minds who create these artifacts of material progress, has evolved into this system that suits only one particular mode of scientific production. And we need radical approaches and, again, radical experimentation to provide other paths. And I think that will represent a better utilization of a lot of these people, and ultimately will create new opportunities and will allow us to have more of the kind of elites that we want. I could speak to the structure of the academy in quite some depth. So maybe we'll get to that. I don't know.
Let's talk about that a little bit. It does seem the universities have really suffered a lot in this respect. I see, and I think a reckoning is coming to everyone, that's not in the top 50. And maybe that helps, right? Maybe that there's just a glut of like PhD students and PhD programs, and maybe that will help a little bit, because I do feel like a lot of the grant making programs that we've created were because politicians, one time, Anton, you're a researcher and you blow on the money on something like a fancy car and not your research. And then that's the front page of the New York Times or whatever. And then now we've got there can be no scientific freedom ever because you might misspend some public dollars. And then you blow up, the whole West collapses, it's like a butterfly flapping his wings. What do you think about that? Where did the Academy go wrong and what does that look like?
So again, trade-offs, right?
Right.
You can't say nobody decided one day and said we're going to drive scientific progress off a cliff.
Right.
Right. So the Academy as it exists today is actually due to a set of deliberate choices made immediately after the Second World War, where basically states around the world realized that fundamental scientific discovery is a important component of national strategy. The atomic bomb is a very material demonstration of that fact. And
right.
Subsequently, the thing is, that idea has proven true because it's how we got semiconductors. It's how we got the internet. It's how we got all sorts of things, the GPS system. It's how we got LCD displays. Like I could rattle off any number of these things. So the changes that happened in the Academy actually fulfilled their purpose, which we shouldn't forget. But in doing so, we made this trade-off. So specifically what happened was the Academy was much more opened up, and who could be a scientist and how science was done went from being something that was almost folk knowledge to being something very professionalized. So the system that we have today of like grant writing and how money flows through the system and how you get like undergrads to participate in research and then become PhDs and then they postdoc and then they maybe get a faculty tenure or they go work for Remtech or whatever. This was a series of deliberate choices to fulfill those policy objectives, and they succeeded in fulfilling those objectives. The problem is that the objectives that this system was designed to fulfill had the side effect of creating or what I think of as like harmonizing the system overall. Every university pretty much functions the same way. Every research group functions almost exactly the same way. There are, you know which conferences to publish in, you know which funding bodies to go for, you kind of know how many seats are at the table in any given year, all of these things. You know what fields are hot. And this harmonization turns science into this fairly monolithic enterprise, which it wasn't really before. Different communities in science historically have done things in different ways. And there's been traditions that have gone across disciplines and across national and other barriers, but generally it was much more predicated on individual relationships and even the way that one became a scientist, or even what a scientist was. A scientist in previous years was not a profession. Nobody, like you can't go out and become a scientist. You're a scientist because of what you do. There's not like a checklist you fill out, right? And that had to go away to create the system we have now. And it's become, somebody taught me this word harmonized. I've been calling it homogenized, where now, because if there's this monolithic system, the whole monolith kind of moves together and it's kind of, everything is done one way. Everything is done for specific purposes. And one of the consequences of that as well is the Academy in general. And when I speak of the Academy, I'm talking not just about like universities, but industrial research labs, any sort of place that's trying to create new knowledge, has evolved into this thing where it can absorb arbitrary amounts of capital, any amount of money, any amount of money. It will absorb it without necessarily producing any improvement in the output. And that's a consequence of deliberate choices, because the Academy as it's organized today was specifically designed to run high capital intensive projects like the Manhattan Project. They understood that they needed a lot of physicists to try to farm these new discoveries and then put a lot of capital behind them when it was time to roll them out. But that means you can only do a certain type of thing. And the other effect of this harmonization is like, you had better tie your research onto the hot thing, because that's what's getting funding today in this monolithic academy.
It's really interesting to me. A lot of people, you see this in the, like you said, the discourse a lot. When they say trust science, they mean trust the institution. not the process. And these seems to
Yeah.
be, these are very discrete things. These are very different.
I think when people say trust science in the discourse, they often mean trust science as it's trust the results of scientists as they're communicated through this telephone to the mass public. And this is honestly another thing. Despite the fact that we have more PhDs across all fields than pretty much I think we've ever had before. I think I haven't kept up on like the year to year, but certainly this decade. Fewer and fewer people seem to, well, I don't know if fewer people, but it's in sort of the ordinary or common imagination, what scientists actually do is more and more abstract. And I think that, again, that's to do with the homogenizing effect, because you never hear like Albert Einstein discovers theory. You hear researchers at MIT, something, something, something.
Right. That's a really good point. It is like it's ultra. It's just like copy paste across, and that seems to allow. It doesn't allow for anyone that doesn't fit in that whatever the mold is to ever escape and create something new.
It's very, very difficult to do. This is a point where actually Don and I differ. Don's position is that you should try to preserve your radicalness. And then you prove to yourself and close collaborators that you're actually a very strong scientist, so that they will back you in his venture research model when it's time to pursue your big, weird, radical ideas. Right? And that works. That's a model that works. My position on that is a little bit different. My position is that we're going to lose a lot of people ever getting to that stage. And I think we ought to start people off actually at a considerably younger age. My explicit position, and besides this idea of elite underproduction, my explicit position on this is we should be throwing students into real scientific research far earlier in their educational career, far earlier, even if it's just to experience basic lab work that actually matters to a result somebody's trying to get. This is a valuable experience that most people don't have until late undergrad at the earliest. And we should just do it. Like we should take high school kids and put them in research labs.
I think that's a great idea, and it helps prevent. I think the problem with Don's thought there is, there's a lot of selection effects, and on top of that, it's I think people underrate how much of a problem it is to get talked out of your good ideas and social pressure and things like that. And then one day you wake up and you meant to like sell yourself and then prove yourself and then be able to go do your cool thing. And then you're too old, your fluid intelligence is dropped and you just can't do it anymore. And it's too late. It just took up too much capital, personal capital.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, Don's model worked as well.
That's fair.
So Don isn't wrong. All I'm suggesting, and again, this again comes back, this isn't an either or. It doesn't mean we ought to tear down the academy as it exists today as well, because it's fulfilling a function. It does pretty well at some things, and we ought not to be blind to that. But what I'm suggesting is it's super cheap, very low risk, relatively easy given the right set of circumstances and connections to just do these experiments and try different ways of doing this. I mean, in comparison to like the average seed or pre-seed round in Silicon Valley, to like start up an independent research lab where you just do math all day in some interesting direction, it's peanuts, nothing. Like I think that like I'm first or second order connections with people who would like lose that money in their pants.
Right, exactly.
That again speaks to the enormous economic surplus that I've been talking about. Absolutely.
Could you talk about that? This is a great transition to your grant program you put together. I thought this was really cool.
Oh yeah, Biddle. Biddle's kind of funny. So that is a joke that got out of control, which is that's a recurring theme in my life. And yeah, sort of the joke was that like Twitter discourse is really bad. I see all these like young people's, I call them Zoomers for Gen Z.
Yeah.
Being out here tweeting and contributing to the discourse when instead they should be out like making stuff. So I said, well, I will pay you to not tweet for a week and make me something and show it. And then if you do, I'll give you $100. It doesn't matter what it is. I want you to come with at least a concrete proposal, and it needs to be kind of in the spirit of Biddle. So it should be something that, you actually did inside that week.
Nice.
but like the metatextual read of that is actually, I just want to inspire creativity. The $100 doesn't really matter. It's the permission to be like, well, go do something interesting and I'll reward you for it. Like $100 isn't really a big deal to most people, right? And we got amazing stuff out of it. We got just incredible. I mean, there's so much drive and creativity, and I'll give you a few things. We had one person make like this weird custom musical instrument made out of like buttons and frets and things like that. Awesome. And they played it for us, and that was super cool. We had another person who created an incubator, like an incubator for chicken eggs, because they are working towards being able to replicate this experiment that this Japanese laboratory did, where they were able to grow chicken embryos outside the egg. Oh wow! And we got a chick out of it whose name is Hercules.
That's awesome.
We had another person who created a release system for their balloon launched orbital glider, and that caught fire in the process of making it. So we got that. We got amazing stuff. We had another person, designing turbo machinery and doing all the CFD for it. I mean, just giving people permission and then showing that, hey, like other people are making stuff. That stuff you want to make, you should just go ahead and make it. I'm gonna allow you. I believe in you that you'll do this. And what's more is like pretty much everybody who signed up was 100% successful. Like really? They didn't tweet, awesome. They just made stuff and they came back with something really cool that they had made.
That's awesome.
And this is, I mean, it speaks to how cheap this is. It's like I think we did like 25 of these things. Right now, we're in the process of creating like a new platform for it, because I was managing this out of like my Twitter DMs and like a spreadsheet and Google Calendar. And it was driving me insane. I'm like, I cannot keep doing this.
Right, so it's too much to manage.
It's too much. It's like somebody pointed out to me that it's exactly the same as like trying to manage a venture fund, and I was like, oh,
no, thanks.
Yeah. So we're building out a web platform right now. We're hoping to relaunch hopefully next month, maybe sooner. But the other thing that we want to be able to do is, again, because this was such a cheap experiment.
Yeah.
And we kind of saw people like doing a little bit their version of it. They were like, oh, I'll give, whoever makes this, or like whoever does this thing, $100, $500, whatever.
Yeah.
And so we're like, okay, great. Well, obviously people want to do this, and like maybe they want to have a different theme to Biddle, but let's make it really easy for people to run these really small, cheap micro grant experiments.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're working on releasing that. The other thing that was surprising actually is just people came out of the woodwork to donate. Like,
that's awesome.
I got tons of messages on the subject being like, hey, can I back some of this? Like, what's going on? So, that's the other thing. We're working on building in a way to like back this and have people, sponsor or like donate for concrete projects, and then they can hang out in like the show and tell, or to, just grants in general or anything like that.
Right.
Most of that first round came out of my pocket, but like, and I was mostly turning donations down because I was like, I don't have the infrastructure to process
to deal with it. Yeah.
Way.
That's great. And well, we'd love to contribute this next time. If you, that's helpful at all, we'd love to. And definitely spread the message.
I really appreciate that. I will let you guys know when we're back up and running.
Very cool. Yeah. And this actually reminds me, have you ever heard of Harry Nyquist at Bell Labs?
I mean, Nyquist is a very familiar name from electrical engineering.
Yes. He did some stuff in like communication theory as well. I'm not.
Yeah, that's right. Nyquist, the Nyquist criteria, Nyquist sampling, all those things.
Right. So I'm less clear on that stuff, but I do know there's a book about Bell Labs, and they talk about how they're trying to figure out who the most successful people were creating patents. And it turned out the only thing they could find was the most successful people always had lunch with Harry. And like Harry would like just like talk to them like, yeah, you should really like follow through that and ask good questions and things. And it kind of sounds like those grants, right? It's like permission to go out there like in the world and do things. People miss that. I don't know. It's really important. There's like some, I guess like there's resistance that builds up in people's minds to go out and do things.
I have this kind of like, it's almost I don't know, it's almost a principle at this point where, barring certain material circumstances, obviously it's not true for people in general, but I think especially in the society that we live in, a lot of people would be happier if they were aware of the full spectrum of choices that were actually available to them, instead of the ones that they just happen to have in their mind at any given time.
Oh, interesting.
And so, like the way that I always frame this to myself, and again, this is a gross oversimplification, that's not applicable to everyone. I was like, well, no matter how wrong this thing goes, I can always move to, Rio and work on a fishing boat, right? Like, you can just do that. That's allowed.
Yes.
Portuguese isn't that hard to learn. You'll be okay.
That's right.
And when you start framing things like that, like, well, okay, well, what are my actual, like, real choices here? And like Biddle is kind of a version of that. It's like, well, you've been trapped in the Twitter discourse for like since you got an account, but what if I told you could do this other thing, which is better and more fun? And
there are more options out there.
I could do that.
Like, that's better. Yeah. It's really interesting. So I run a Slate Star Codex meetup, and one of the things that I really like to do, because everybody, they're quite smart, but a lot of them don't, I'll ask them, like, how was your week? It's like, well, I work at this big tech company, and it's like, it's drudgery and I don't really like it. I'd really like to be working on this other thing, but, with this startup, but, yeah, I don't know, maybe in the future. And then I do this thing, I call it hazing, but I make them, and I write the email for them to the founder, or like to whatever organization they actually want to be working for, and make them send it like while we're on the call. And people have got like responses from different folks, but people just get so trapped in that, like, your day to day, right? Just like you said, and they forget that the downside risk is really like, there's no real downside. Like, it's so small nowadays.
It's difficult to quantify, but like the worst possible outcome is mostly not so bad. Like, if if you're the sort of person who has a big 10 company job and you're miserable, well, you can probably just go back to a big tech company job if this. You can just go back. They like it if you come from another big tech company.
That's right. Exactly. Well, and this is this misallocation of risk, right? Between the risk is like, the real risk is wasting your time here, not, that you end up on a fishing boat, and the fishing boat might be nice, actually.
Yeah. I mean, so, I don't know if risk is the right framing, because risk implies that you have some quantity of something that you could possibly lose. But and that's a very, given that you run a Slate Star Codex meetup, that's a very rationalist way of looking at the world. Which, it's almost derivative of utilitarian philosophy, but I think it's actually a more general principle than just that. I don't think that you have to regard it as sort of risk reward. I think it's possible to regard it as just, here is the branching set of decisions that I have
that exist
available to me, and I can pursue the subset of that. Like, there's a much larger subset of that than most people have in their awareness most of the time. And this was a neat little experiment to sort of, in part, expand that in both sides. Like, you can just give money to young people. Like, you can just do that. If you're like, oh, I wish I could foster creativity, I don't know, this costs like $2,500 and we got 25 cool projects out of it. Just go do it.
Well, it reminds me of Don's work. It's like, it's no money. I mean, it's just no,
it's nothing.
It's no money. It's just mind blowing.
I'm actually, I mean, another part of it is I'm actually pretty inspired by a friend of mine, Sonia Mann, who is like, she also hazes me in the sense of like, you keep talking about these things, but like, I'm going to stop taking you seriously unless you actually do it. Which has been really good for me, because now I've got like a little Sonia in the back of my mind.
That's great. That's really helpful. You need that, you need that. You need somebody breathing down your neck.
She's secretly terrifying. So like, that's a motivator.
It really works. That's great. I wanted to move on now and ask you just some overrated, underrated questions, and like maybe a sentence why.
Well, before you get to overrated, underrated, can I ask Anton a question?
Sure, absolutely.
Anton, are you an optimist or a pessimist? And are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future?
I am generally optimistic about both for a few different reasons. One is, regardless of the problems that we see in the world today, humans collectively have lived through or overcome problems that in their time were, we didn't even have ideas about how to begin solving. We simply didn't have the knowledge to do so. And if we did have the knowledge, we certainly wouldn't have had the resources to enact any of those solutions. So in that sense, our problems are not bigger than what's gone before, and we're actually doing better because we are living in a time where we've preserved and built up enough knowledge that we can start, we can seriously, if we get our act together, we can just do things. We can figure out what needs to be done and then do the thing. And I know that people like Bostrom are always talking about well, as we develop technically, we put ourselves at greater and greater risk. I'm not sure that I really agree with that, because the worst risks that we could in principle face are always going to be external. And so our ability, our technical capability as it develops, will make us better able to actually deal with those external risks that we didn't generate ourselves. So from those two places, I'm an optimist. From history and from our current position and from where we're at, and just humanity collectively and individually has gone through horrible things, just awful. Yes. I mean, I don't know if you've read about, for example, the 30 Years' War in Europe, but in terms of, for example, fraction of populations involved one way or another in that war, we haven't seen anything like it in hundreds of years. And with any luck, we never will again. If we talk about sort of, issues with environmental degradation, we're at a point where a lot of these they're problems of chemistry. We could, in principle, solve them if we commit to solve them through technological means. But even beyond that, the fact that we understand that there is a problem, and we've given ourselves the time to be able to address it, and we're in a position where we have the knowledge. I mean, I have to be optimistic. I think to be a pessimist is a strange choice in light of historical and material fact. What that future exactly is going to look like and how long things will take to get better, and in what sense will they be better, I don't know. But in the sense of will humanity continue to move into the future and improve and just hopefully making people's lives better and easier, I think we will. And of course, one way to think about that is we're almost on a society-wide hedonic treadmill. People from the past would kill to have some of our problems, yes. and some of them literally did. I mean, yes. But that's not to minimize the problems that we do have. There are different sets of problems. They're also horrible, but we're at least in a place where we actually seriously consider overcoming them, instead of being well, this is what life is. I slave away in my field under the auspices of my local lord, and then I die.
Right.
Yep. And hopefully a sufficient number of my 15 children live long enough that I'm supported into old age when my body is broken. Should I live that long?
Exactly. Anton, you sound almost as much like a rationalist as you do an optimist.
I have to admit, I've been reading David Deutsch's book, Beginning of Infinity, lately, and I have a lot of problems with it, but I like a lot of the way he frames some ideas I guess I've always carried around. So I guess I may have related some of that in his words, but generally I agree. Although there's a lot in that book I disagreed with fundamentally. So
good stuff. All right. So overrated or underrated? The Soviet Union.
Difficult. So I would say generally overrated by people in the West and overrated by people in the former Soviet Union. But it's important to remember that the Soviets were not a monolith. And there's different parts of it. I mean, if you say something like Kolmogorov underrated or overrated, well, regardless of how highly you rate him, is still underrated when he was part of the Soviet system.
Right.
But if you say something like collective farming in the 1920s,
different thing.
Pretty bad. So
Not good.
It's difficult to reply to something like that. I certainly think that as a social structure, it had pretty bad problems and probably isn't as rosy as a lot of people who want to resurrect its ghost believe that it was, even for ordinary average people.
Gotcha. That's good. Modern robotics. I know that's an area you work in.
That's right. Internal to the field, I think we have pretty clear eyes. Externally, strongly overrated about what people think robots can do.
Gotcha.
You see really nice Boston Dynamics videos, and then the thing about them is they're they move really nice, but they don't do much because they don't understand the world very well, and that's sort of the hardest problem right now.
Gotcha. And that's an area you're working in now. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I work in robotic perception, 3D computer vision, those sorts of things.
Gotcha. Very interesting. So driverless cars, overrated, underrated?
Well, I think we've seen the consolidation of that industry over the last while, and nobody's making money on it still.
Right.
But at the same time, like we already had a meteor downturn about it. I think what's going to happen is like every piece of technology of that form, like it's going to bear fruit, but 10 years from now, and maybe in unexpected ways.
Gotcha. And on the same token, modern robotics, like you see the Boston Dynamics, and like you said, how long until we've got, the sci-fi, and I know how long is very difficult, but is it far off, or is there like a pathway you see to like, household robotics that are kind of
you're talking about something like Rosie from the Jetsons, right?
Yes, exactly.
So you have some general purpose robot that can do all the domestic chores in your home.
Right.
That problem is virtually equivalent to having artificial general intelligence.
So it's like, it's so far off, can't even.
I would
pathway.
say that however you estimate that, you need to peg your estimate to wherever you think AGI is going to come in, because they're essentially the same thing. And I'm actually not convinced that like general self-driving isn't the same problem.
Gotcha. So it's very, very difficult. That's really good.
I will give you bands of between 30 and 100 years,
Gotcha.
But I could be way off.
Yeah, it's really interesting because you do see, it's very vivid. Like, like you said, the Boston Dynamics robots running around, and yeah, interesting. Malthus, overrated, underrated?
Misunderstood, and I'll agree with Tyler Cowan about that. Malthus wasn't actually wrong, as I said in the stakes. I think he's definitely misunderstood and misinterpreted in our time, and he ought to be re-examined.
Gotcha. That's good. Well, Anton, thank you for coming on. Where can people find your work, and is there any parting shots you'd like to leave people with? Sure.
Yeah. You can find me on Twitter at ATROYN. You can find my website at Troynikov.io. And as for a parting shot, I sort of, all the talks I've given and everything I've done in the interintellect salons have always had the same thing. People need to remember that they are actors in history, and that they, in their time, in their place, can have an influence on the world. And I think that the first step to like making things or changing things for the better is remembering that history isn't done, and history isn't this fictional account of what went before. Real people went through this. Real people made choices at the time, and so can you. That's where I'd like to leave.
I love that. I really love that. Thanks, Anton.
Thanks,
Thank
Anton.
you, Will. Thank you.